"This van's getting towed. You can't live on public streets." The officer slapped a boot on the front tire before the homeless man could even climb out. 2 hours later, that same officer would be standing at attention, saluting the man he'd just had arrested. Rewind 11 days. Retired General Marcus Ellison Reed was 71 years old. He'd spent 41 years in the United States Army, starting as a 19-year-old private from a farming town in Nebraska, ending as a 4-star general who'd commanded entire divisions across 3 continents. He'd briefed presidents. He'd buried men he trained personally. He'd earned a Distinguished Service Medal, 2 silver stars, and a chest full of ribbons that most soldiers only read about in history books. Now he lived in a 2004 Ford Econoline van, parked wherever the local ordinances allowed, in a town called Fairview that didn't know his name. 18 months earlier, his wife of 39 years, Diane, had died of pancreatic cancer in a VA hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and goodbye. 6 after her funeral, their only son, an Army captain himself, was killed in a training accident at Fort Bragg. A rotor failure, quick, senseless, the kind of death that doesn't come with closure. General Reed had buried a wife and a son within the same season. He sold the house 4 months later. He said he couldn't stand the silence in it. He said the walls remembered too much. Didn't tell anyone who he used to be. He didn't want pity, and he especially didn't want people treating grief like a medal ceremony. He simply drove. For the first few months, he stayed in decent motels. Then his pension, which should have comfortably covered it, got tangled in a VA benefits processing error nobody at the regional office seemed able or willing to fix quickly. Paperwork sat in some administrative queue for months. He didn't chase it. He'd spent 41 years being told to be patient with bureaucracy, and old habits held even when they shouldn't have. He never once told anyone his rank. Every morning he woke at 5:30 a.m. out of pure muscle memory, folded his blanket into a precise military crease, and walked to the same diner 2 blocks from wherever he'd parked the night before. He tipped generously, even when he barely could afford to. When a young waitress named Callie mentioned she was short on rent that month, working 2 jobs while raising a toddler alone, General Reed quietly left an extra $100 folded under his coffee cup the next morning and never brought it up again. When a teenage boy at the gas station couldn't cover the last $4 of his tank, Reed paid the difference without a word and drove off before the boy could even say thank you. When a fellow van dweller named Curtis, a younger veteran himself struggling badly with alcohol and shame, sat outside crying one night, Reed didn't lecture him. He simply sat down beside him on the curb and said, "Rank doesn't disappear when the uniform comes off, son. You're still the man who served." Curtis never forgot that sentence. He wrote it down on a napkin and kept it in his wallet. Reed spent his mornings at the public library, reading newspapers cover to cover, a habit from decades of intelligence briefings. He spent afternoons doing odd jobs, fixing fences, hauling scrap, anything that paid in cash and didn't ask questions. He never panhandled. He never asked for charity. While Fairview's newly appointed code enforcement officer, Officer Grant Pierce, had made it his personal mission to clean up the town's parking lots and public streets before the annual town council review. Pierce was 34, ambitious, freshly promoted, desperate to prove himself to a town council that had been publicly critical of vagrancy problems near the shopping district. Pierce didn't see people. He saw statistics. He'd noticed General Reed's van parked near the public library 3 times that week. Same spot, same neat exterior, same quiet old man reading newspapers on a public bench. To Pierce, that was a problem waiting to be solved. "You can't keep parking here," Pierce told him the first time, tapping his citation pad. "This isn't a residence." Reed nodded respectfully. "Understood, officer. I'll move along." Every single time. He never argued. He never raised his voice. He simply relocated to whatever street was technically permitted, night after night, quietly absorbing citation after citation he had no ability to pay. Pierce mistook the old man's composure for defiance. He didn't understand that Reed had once stood calmly in front of insurgent gunfire without flinching. A parking ticket wasn't going to rattle him. By the 3rd week, Pierce had built what he considered a case. He didn't know the man's name. He'd never asked. He'd simply labeled the file subject, unidentified male, van occupant, chronic violator. One evening, Reed sat parked outside the Fairview Community Center, where a local veterans support meeting was quietly wrapping up inside, a meeting he hadn't attended, though he'd noticed the flyer weeks earlier and considered it, then decided against it. That's when Pierce's patrol car pulled up behind him, lights flashing. "Sir, step out of the vehicle," Pierce said, already reaching for handcuffs, his tone sharpened by weeks of frustration. Reed stepped out slowly, hands visible, calm as ever. "Officer, I understand you have a job to do. I'd simply ask for a moment to gather a few personal items from the vehicle before it's towed." "You'll get your things at the impound lot," Pierce snapped. "This van's getting towed. You can't live on public streets." A small crowd had begun gathering outside the community center as the veterans meeting let out. Men and women, several of them veterans themselves, watching the scene unfold in the parking lot. A few exchanged uncomfortable glances. Nobody stepped forward. To one woman, Deborah Alvarez, a retired Army nurse in her 60s, who ran the support group, stepped halfway toward the scene before her better judgment held her back. But she stood there, watching, already deciding she would follow up on this the moment it was over. Pierre's hands in front of him. A technically unnecessary escalation for a parking violation, done more for effect than procedure, in front of a growing audience. "Officer," Reed said quietly, still composed, "may I at least retrieve a small box from the passenger seat? It contains personal documents, nothing more." Pierce hesitated, then allowed a young rookie beside him to retrieve the box instead of Reed doing it himself. The rookie, Officer Danny Okafor, barely 6 months on the force, opened the passenger door and lifted a modest cardboard box off the seat. Scene 36 inside, sitting on top of folded paperwork, was a small velvet case. Okafor, out of simple curiosity, flipped it open. 4 silver stars gleamed against dark velvet, beside a folded certificate bearing a name Okafor's own late grandfather, an Army lifer himself, had spoken about with reverence more than once at family dinners. Okafor's hands went still. "Sir," he said quietly, staring at the case, then up at the parking lot went completely silent. Pierce turned, confused. "What are you talking about?" Okafor held the case out toward him, his voice barely steady. "4-star general, sir, retired. My grandfather served under the 3rd Infantry Division. He talked about General Reed his entire life." Deborah Alvarez, watching from the community center steps, pressed a hand to her mouth. Pierce looked at the handcuffed man standing in front of him, composed, silent, dignified even now, and felt something cold settle into his stomach. That can't be right," Pierce said, though his voice had lost its earlier certainty entirely. Reed simply looked at him, calm as ever. "It's all right, son. You were doing your job. You didn't know." But Okafor was already pulling out his phone, scrolling frantically, pulling up a military archive page, a photograph from a decade-old ceremony matching, unmistakably, the face of the man standing handcuffed in a Fairview parking lot. Within minutes, word had spread through the small crowd outside the community center. Several veterans in attendance, men Reed had never met, straightened instinctively at the mention of his name and rank. Pierce removed the handcuffs himself, his hands visibly unsteady, mumbling something close to an apology that came out fragmented and inadequate. The story didn't stay contained to that parking lot for long. Deborah Alvarez, the support group leader, had connections across the regional Veterans Affairs network, and by the following morning, the story had reached a local news reporter, then a state Veterans Affairs office, then within 72 hours, national coverage. The VA benefits error that had trapped General Reed's pension in bureaucratic limbo for months was resolved within 48 hours once his file landed on the desk of a regional director who recognized exactly whose paperwork had been sitting untouched. Fairview's town council, facing sudden and unwanted national scrutiny, held an emergency session. Officer Pierce was placed on administrative leave pending a full review of his enforcement conduct. Resigned before the review concluded, choosing to avoid a public disciplinary hearing that would have followed him permanently. General Reed, meanwhile, was offered, and firmly, politely declined, a ceremonial key to the city, a gesture he found faintly absurd given the circumstances. What he accepted instead was quieter and more meaningful. The town council, at Deborah Alvarez's insistence, established a permanent emergency housing fund for veterans facing homelessness in Fairview, seated initially with the very fine and court costs Reed himself had been assessed, now reversed and redirected. Private Veterans Foundation, moved by the story, covered Reed's temporary housing costs, while his benefits were fully restored, and quietly repaired and returned his van to him. "That van got me through a year I didn't think I'd survive. I'm not interested in pretending it didn't happen." Officer Danny Okafor, the rookie who'd recognized him, received a personal letter from General Reed himself, along with an invitation to attend the following year's 3rd Infantry Division reunion as his personal guest. Curtis, the younger veteran Reed had once comforted on a curb outside a gas station, appeared at the Fairview courthouse the week the story broke, hands shaking, holding a napkin gone soft from months in his wallet. He simply showed Reed what was written on it, in Reed's own remembered words. "Rank doesn't disappear when the uniform comes off." Reed enrolled in the Veterans Support Group himself the following week. He walked in, sat down among strangers who were no longer strangers, and, for the first time since Diane's funeral, said her name and his son's name out loud in a room full of people who understood exactly what that silence had cost him. 1 year later, General Reed stood in the same Fairview Community Center parking lot, no longer handcuffed, no longer unnamed, dressed simply, holding a cup of coffee from the same diner 2 blocks away. Beside him stood Curtis, 6 months sober, holding a set of keys to a small apartment secured through the new Veterans Housing Fund. Scene 58. "You ever think about how differently that night could have gone?" Okafor asked quietly. "If I hadn't opened that box?" Reed considered the question for a long moment. "Rank doesn't disappear when the uniform comes off," he said finally. whether anyone opens the box or not. Here's what this story really asks of us. Dignity was never meant to be conditional on what someone can prove about their past. So ask yourself, how many people have you walked past today, quietly assuming their circumstances told you everything you needed to know about who they are? If this story moved you, drop the word honor in the comments below. Hit like if you believe every person deserves dignity, regardless of their circumstances. Share this with someone who needs the reminder today. And subscribe. Next week, another story is waiting for you.